holding on Daf Chof Beis, Amud Beis 22b, and we've been learning this special law of Chavoit Rami, which is allowing us, according to halacha, to imagine something that's above to be lowered and to be able to create a change in halacha by lowering it. Or in the case that we are dealing with, it's a sukkah that has schach. That's some of it is above, some of it is higher up, some of it is lower. We also talked about a case of tumah and an oihel for tumah, where there's a tent, and it had to do with someone who seems to have been building his house, and in the midst of the building, doing the first and second floor at the same time. It's an interesting way how to build like that. I would think that they would want to finish the first floor before they build the second floor, but for some reason they were doing it both at the same time. And they have some boards for the first floor ceiling and some boards for the second floor ceiling. And the case had to do with a potential the laws of Oyel, because if we use this rule of Chavoit Rami, we could lower the upper ceiling, the second floor ceiling, to be considered flush with the first floor ceiling and make it a full Oyel and make a tent around the entire structure. And then the impurity would actually extend throughout. And that was the law of Tumah. Then there's also the case where we were dealing with a case of Eruvin, where you have an Eruv. We're doing a shituf, you're doing a mavo, you want to close off the fourth wall of a alley, and in order to be able to carry on Shabbos. And that fourth wall is going to be an imaginary wall. And the way to make that wall, we're dealing with the option of called a koira. There's also an option called a lechi. There's two ways of making that imaginary wall. But we were dealing with the way called koira, where you have some type of a beam that goes across. And we considered over there using the rule of Chavoit Rami, because it has to be a certain thickness. And what happens if you have a little of that thickness above and a little of that thickness below, and you make that beam in from two beams, and you want to attach the two imagine that they are attached, and then make it a imaginary wall. And in order to do that, it seems like we need to rely on the law of Chavoit Rami, and the Gemara used that as a question on our Gemara. Why was it a question? It was a question because it sounded like from there that you don't need to have the size of the width of a handbreadth in order to use the law of Chavoit Rami. And that would contradict one of our main important laws that we included in our ruling of when you could say Chavoit Rami. We said one of the main laws about Chavoit Rami is that it has to be at least a handbreadth size in order to be able to lower it down and throw it below to where we want it to be a wall, or ceiling, or oihel, or tent. So that was basically the Gemara without getting into the specific details. That would be like a little summary of the general gist of the Gemara. Now, let's just remind ourselves also what we're dealing with here. We're talking about Sukkah Hameduvleles. We're talking about this Sukkah that is a Sukkah that has two layers of schach, one higher and one lower. There was another interpretation of Meduvleles, which we're not talking about. And that interpretation had to do with a Sukkah that has a very poor amount of schach, a very limited amount of schach. And that was another translation of Meduvleles. That was Rab's interpretation. But we're following Shmuel's interpretation. And Shmuel's interpretation was that it had these two layers of schach. And the two layers of schach, the problem that we saw, that we understood, was, according to Rashi, that the sun is getting into the sukkah, coming in from the sides. because it's getting in from the sides, the question is, could we imagine that the schach is all together? And in that case, the schach is sufficient, and it's like it protects the sukkah from the sun. It doesn't, but it's imaginarily does. We can imagine that it does. That's the way Rashi understood it, and we saw that Tosfos didn't understand it that way. He was more bothered with the fact that the schach doesn't have sufficient. Each layer of schach we look at individually, and each one doesn't seem to have sufficient. It doesn't have sufficient amount in order to make it that it's more shade than sunlight. We look at each of them individually. So the law was that if they're within 3 handbreadths, you don't have any of these problems. If it's within 3 handbreadths, then we look at the law, we consider the law of Lavud. But if they're more than 3 handbreadths, that's where Rava came in and said Chavoit Rami. So that's the background, the backdrop really of this discussion of Chavoit Rami is really this is where what it all boils down to, using Chavoit Rami to permit 2 layers of schach that should theoretically not make the sukkah not kosher, but Chavoit Rami might help us and make the sukkah into a kosher sukkah. And Rava said that as long as there's that tefach, that would allow the sukkah to be a kosher sukkah, because if it's a tefach thick, then we're able to use this halacha l'maisha misinai of Chavoit Rami. Now, we also mentioned yesterday that there is discussion among the Rishonim about the size of the airspace below, that this tefach thick, or more than a tefach thick, board is going to be lowered and fit in. So there is one of the Rishonim that says it actually has to fit perfectly. Like it has to be the same size. The amount of space below has to be the amount of space that the actual board takes up. Then we said there's other Rishonim that say as long as it's a tefach below, or maybe it doesn't matter how much space is below at all. It's the main thing is as long as the top thing is a tefach. And so there's discussion among the Rishonim how to spell out, how to fulfill this. These are requirements of Chavoit Rami. How do you fulfill those requirements? And if I'm not mistaken, it's brought in Shulchan Aruch. This case of Sukkah Meduvlelas, and between the Mechaber and the Ramah, they deal with that type of issue. In fact, Tuf Reish Lamed Aleph Sif Hey, Tuf Reish Lamed Aleph Sif Hey, that would be Tuf Reish is 631, chapter 631 in Shulchan Aruch, and maybe we'll just pull it up right here. I'll just show you the Shulchan Aruch law, how Shulchan Aruch presents it. 631 in Orach Chaim, 631, paragraph 5. And it also talks about the next thing about the sukkah, how much sunlight and shade, which is another discussion we're going to be dealing with shortly. So here it says, Haya hasikoch meduvlo. If the schach is perush mevulbal, if the schach, this is Shulchan Aruch, this is the Beis Yosef, the Rabbi Yosef Kairo's Shulchan Aruch. Haya sikoch meduvlo. If the schach is mevulbal, it's disorderly. There's some of the v'hu hasikoch. This is the schach that some of it is above, some of it is below. It's kosher. That's our Mishnah. As long as there is no difference between 3 handbreadths between the ones above and below, There's not 3 handbreadths. Who said that view in the Gemara? Who was the author of that rule that it can't be more than 3 handbreadths separation? In our Gemara on page 22a, that was Abaye's statement. Abaye said, "Lo shanu ela she'ein bein zeh lezeh shloisha tfachim." Right, that was Abaye's statement in the Gemara that there can't be more than 3 handbreadths. And Rava came along and said, even if there's more than 3 handbreadths, it could be kosher as long as we can say chavoit rami with the if it's a tefach. What does the Shulchan Aruch say? If it has a tefach of space, even though it's more of a distance than 3 handbreadths, the top schach from the bottom schach, but since the top schach has the size, the width of a handbreadth, that will be kosher. We can imagine that that schach goes down below and it touches the edge of the lower schach, and as long as it's mechuvan neged sfas hayorid, as long as it's corresponding to that area where the lower schach is. And the Ramah says this means that there's space between the lower schach, a tefach, a handbreadth, that it's fit to lower the upper schach, and then it will be kosher, even if chamsa meruba, even if now it's more sunlight than shade, it's kosher that it will be considered that the shade is more. That it'll be considered that the shade is more when the sun is in the middle of the sky. So in other words, it's not disqualified even at other times, even when the sun is not. Let me just read you the English translation of Sefaria at the last sentence over here. The Ramah says there is a tefach in the space of the bottom one, such that one could bring down the top one, meaning the top schach, and then it is valid, even if its sunlit area exceeds the shaded area, since when the sun is at its zenith, directly overhead, the shaded part of the directly overhead, the shaded part of the sukkah floor does exceed its sunlit area. The sukkah should not be disqualified because of the sunlight that comes in at other times from the side at an angle, which means that we consider it kosher, and it seems like he's saying because when the sun is in the middle, it will be enough sunlight. So, in a certain sense, it sounds like he's saying a little like Tosfos over there, saying not that we consider the Chavoit Rami makes it that we consider it always to be that it's shade. It's not that we consider it that the Chavoit Rami makes it imagined to be shade. No, it's that the schach itself was problematic because each of the schachs don't have enough to make it majority shade. And when the sun is on the side, it comes in and it's more sunlight than shade. Nevertheless, we look at it like the sun is on top. When the sun is on top, we don't look at it when the sun is on the side. So then it's a little unclear how the Beis Yosef learns. We'll have to take a look in his Sefer Beis Yosef on the tour to see exactly who he's following, because it's a little. The reason I say it's a little unclear from here is because, according to Rashi, you would think you don't care at all about where the fact that the sun is, we imagine that the sun's on top. You would think that we use Chavod Rami to say that it's kosher, not that because the sun on, if the sun is in the middle of the sky, it's kosher. It's because even if the sun is on the side, it's going to be kosher because we use the rule of Chavod Rami. According to Taisvis, on the other hand, the fact that the sun is on top, the issue was never that really there was too much sunlight. It was only imagination that there's too much sunlight because we always look at it that the sun is on the top. We only when the sun is exactly on top of the sukkah, and then there's more shade than sunlight. The only issue was that the schach was two different layers of schach, and what each layer was not sufficient in its own on its own to be able to provide more sunlight. So it wasn't like more shade. So it wasn't like you saw more sunlight than shade. So it does seem a little confusing how exactly the Beis Yosef learned. But the bottom line is that the way the Ramah explains it, you need to have a space on the bottom the size of a tefach. It has to have the size of empty space of a handbreadth for the top schach to be lowered to use this rule of Chavot Rami. Now, the Mishnah Berurah wants to say that it can't be less space than the size of the upper kana, than the upper one. It has to be at least the size. That's what it seems like the Mishnah Berurah says. He says the chalal shebatachton should be mechuvan, should be corresponding to the empty space on the bottom, should be corresponding to the thickness of the board on top, that it should be fit, that you would lower the upper board in between the bottom boards, which be in that empty space, like the Ramah explains, and that excludes if it was too small in its measurement from the upper board. So it sounds like it at least has to be as big as the upper board, and then it's kosher. And then the Mishnah Berurah tries to explain the confusing words at the end. He says, even though it's more sunlight than shade, when the sun is on the side and it's shining through the angle, through the diagonal, nevertheless, since when the sun is exactly above, it will be more shade than sunlight, it is kosher. So is that because, in other words, my question on this would be, do you need Chavod Rami to say that? If we look at it, if we measure it based on the sun being on top of it, would it give enough shade? Then maybe we don't need Chavod Rami. Now, why does Chavod? How do you look at the sukkah? Do you look at the sukkah as the sun is on the side, or do you look at the sukkah as if the sun is right above it? If you look at the sukkah the way that as if the sun is right above it, then what do you need Chavod Rami over here? You have different layers of schach, okay, but the fact is it's giving more shade than sunlight. And so what's the Chavod Rami benefiting? It's giving more shade because the sun is right above. It must be. That's why I think he's learning like Taisvis. Yes, what did you want to say, Victor?
So maybe the Chavot Rami is for the other times of the day when the sun is is the other angles, not the angle, not the direct above angle. Maybe you have a little bit of each one.
Well, the thing is that if Chavod Rami works, then I would think that he would just say that because of Chavot Rami, we imagine that it's always shaded, not like, oh, well, as long as when it's in the middle, it's kosher, that's kosher for the rest of it. It sounds like he's saying that makes it kosher for the rest of the day also, not like you need Chavot Rami for the rest of the day. You know what I mean? It sounds like this is the reason why it's kosher, because when the sun is straight up, it's enough shade. It doesn't sound like he's saying two separate reasons and you need to, in other words, Chavot Rami would be according to the way you're explaining it, I would think that he should just say the reason of Chavot Rami, because that's going to be the majority of the day. You need that reason, Chavot Rami, and that reason actually works even when the sun is in the middle. The Chavot Rami is also good, because the fact is, we imagine that it's all there. It has shade, it doesn't have shade, it's kosher. Chavot Rami, it's always kosher. Chavot Rami. He says no, it's not kosher. It's not. It doesn't say because of Chavot Rami. We imagine even if there's more sunlight, it's okay because the sun is when it's above, when straight above, it gives more shade. I think he's learning like Tosfos. I have to look it up in the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef is a commentary on the Torah. He wrote another book there, and there you can see his sources for the way he explains the paskins in the Shulchan Aruch, because the way he develops his explanation on the Torah, it sort of expresses his view and how he's going to finalize his verdict when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch. So that would be the place to look it up. But my impression is he seems to be following Tosfos, and that's why he's giving this as sort of like a separate point. You have two issues on a sukkah meduvlelis. You have a sukkah that the fact is the schach is two different layers, and each layer is not really sufficient schach. And then this different issue is the fact that there's more sunlight than shade practically. On the non-practical problem, the fact that the each layer doesn't give sufficient schach, on that you have Chavot Rami. You need Chavot Rami. On the practical problem of having too much sunlight, that he says no. You have Tosfos's point that we look at the sun the way it is, when it's straight above, in the sun the way it is when it's straight on top of it, then you don't have more sunlight than shade, and that's good enough. So that's what it seems to me that he's holding. But anyway, the reason I brought the Shulchan Aruch was more to see this other concept of how much space do you need below. Rashi and Tosfos here don't seem to hold about the space below to be significant. Other Rishonim emphasize this, and the Shulchan Aruch does seem, at least the Ramah definitely adds that point. In the Mechaber, in the Rabbi Yosef Kairo himself, he just says that it's a little vague. He says, we imagine that it's as if it was lowered and it touches the edge of this lowered schach, but it does need to be mechuvan. It needs to be corresponding to the edge of the lower schach. Now, what does it mean corresponding to the edge of the lower schach? So the way the Mishnah Berurah understands it, it means that the Ramah is explaining what the Mechaber means. It's not an argument. And the way he understands it is to be that the Ramah and the Mechaber seem to agree that it's, you need enough space below to fit the thing that you're lowering. And that's the way the Mishnah Berurah seems to understand it. I believe you could maybe understand it a little differently. Not necessarily are they agreeing, but it definitely sounds that they're the Ramah seems to be explaining it. The Hainu, he says this means that there's avir that there's space that you could lower the upper one, and so yeah, it definitely seems like he's explaining that maybe there's not an argument. The only thing is the Mishnah Berurah's understanding is not necessarily so that has to be as big. The Ramah doesn't say exactly those words. The Ramah says that there is space, a tefach, that it would be fitting to lower the upper, and then it's kosher. So the interesting thing that I'm seeing is that the Ramah is the one who adds about the sun being in the middle of the sky. I've come up with a new understanding now.
Rabbi?
The new understanding, just 1 second, Moshe. My new understanding is that the Ramah is adding this point, and maybe the Mechaber, the Rabbi Yosef Kairo, doesn't necessarily follow Tosfos over here. It's really the Ramah saying
So
that.
in my English translation, it's basically saying the Ramah is explaining the
Right.
Shulchan Aruch this way because they write Ramah and then he says in other words,
In other words,
which
yeah,
means he's explaining what Joseph Caro is saying.
the saying. Correct.
Yeah.
But then at the end, he adds a point there that, of course, the Mishabura tries to explain. It's a little unclear, and this is what we've been talking about now about this. The fact that he adds this point that the sun is when it's exactly in the middle, meaning when it's the above this sukkah, it'll be more shade than sunlight. That point was not mentioned by the Mechaber. So that would be a reason to say maybe the Mechaber, maybe Rabbi Yosef Cairo doesn't necessarily agree to that. Again, the first point, it sounds like the Ramah is trying to explain the Mechaber. But then he adds this point. And by the way, even if it's kosher, even if it's more sunlight than shade, when the sun is, because of the fact that the sun sun is when the sun is in the middle, it'll be more shade than sunlight. In other words, I could see that Rabbi Yosef Cairo learns that we look at the main thing is the way the sun is on the side, not of the way it is straight above. And it's still going to be kosher, not because it's more shade than sunlight physically. It's because we imagine that it's more shade than sunlight because of the law of this law that we learned over here called Chavot Rami. That's why it's kosher. Because of this law, it's imagined that it's more shade than sunlight. The way the Ramah ends off is that it's because we look at it when the sun is right above. When the sun is right above, of course, it'll be more shade than sunlight because the sun is being blocked at all areas. Now, whether it's from the upper layer or the lower area of lower layer of the schach, either layer is blocking ultimately blocking the sun when it's straight above. When the sun is on the side, that's when the sun can get in. So, in any event, we see that the Shulchan Aruch does deal with these issues, and it deserves to be looked into exactly what the Rabbi Yosef Cairo holds, and also the Ramah. If you look at the end, he mentions that it's the Ran, the Ran and the Rambam. So it seems like he's following the view of the Ran and the Rambam, which we'll have to look up. Yes, Jeffrey.
I view this as an procedure for an emergency. It's a day when you cannot fix the sky. And the wind blew, and the mat blew over and left a space on the side, and it doubled over in the middle, and you can't climb up on the day of the holiday and climb up and fix it. And it's not tied down, because most of us don't want to have it tied down. And so in this emergency situation, you can see that the top part has become doubled because the mat flew over. I saw it. I saw it here in Boston where that kind of thing happened, and nobody could climb up and fix it. And also, I saw it in a very high sukkah where it requires a lot of dexterity and a big ladder to fix it. So when it's not possible, so then you can say, okay, look, we have this distance, we have this separation, but for today, we can put this procedure into effect by declaring it this type of thing, and then tomorrow we can get up on the ladder and we can fix it.
So I hear what you're saying, and it sounds good because you're trying to figure out the practical situation here, why someone would do such a thing, and that's what you're trying to answer. The only thing is that the way you're explaining it, I don't think fits, and I'll tell you why. The way you're explaining it is that how do you have an upper layer and a lower layer? It's the mat is bent, is diagonal now. it's somehow bent, and some of it was above, some of it is below. And if that was the case, I don't think that's called a separation of 3 handbreadths, because what you have is just schach that's slanted and it's all attached to each other. Here we're talking about there's actually a separation of upper schach and lower schach. It's 2 separate layers. If you have schach on a slant, I don't think that's called sukkah miduvlelas. I think that's fine. And because we had a Mishnah like that before, where it was slanted and using the wall as schach, that I don't think falls into the category of miduvlelas, because there's no area where the schach is separated from the other schach. It's all attached. It just happens to be slanted. But here, what we're dealing with is 2 separate layers. And the only case that maybe you could say similar to what you're saying, or maybe this is what you mean, is if you have 2 different mats, and one mat ends up lower, and then a different mat, which is separated from the first mat, that actually flew up a level and somehow is hanging, a little higher up than the other one. Is that so practical? I don't think so. You think your case where it just bends over and, that's practical. That happens. And I'm sure, the wind anywhere could especially when you reach higher heights, the wind is stronger. But the practicality of one mat going higher and the other one being lower, and it fits exactly the space that you need, I don't know how practical that is. And so we're back to your original question of, so why would anyone build a sukkah like this that it's miduvlelas? So that's a good question. But anyway, that's my thought. Again, is it possible? Yeah, it's possible to have it. If I think the case that I gave, is that what you meant really? That's 2 separate mats, or did you really mean that it's one mat? You're muted. Whatever. Okay. Anyway, bottom line is, whatever you meant, I think that gives us a little understanding of what we're dealing with here. And of course, if anyone comes up with more practical reason why someone would do this, that would be interesting to figure out. But or if they think it's practical that when the wind comes, that it would actually blow a mat to be exactly above where it's supposed to be, and somehow you would use this chavot rami rule. To say that such a thing would happen, to me would be more, I don't know, it doesn't sound like it's so practical. In any event, what we saw was in Shulchan Aruch that it's this concept of a sukkah miduvlelas, and I guess the reason why this would happen is probably has to do with convenience of some of the schach versus the other schach. Maybe some of your sukkah is higher than the other. Some of the walls are higher than the other walls. In the olden days, they didn't have good saws, and they didn't have electric saws. So you had some of your sukkah is higher, some is lower. Would that be a kosher sukkah? I guess that maybe is more the practical side of it, where you have some above and some below. You got a few boards that are few walls that are higher, and a few walls. Imagine you're taking boards that are used for other things. So it's not necessarily are all your boards equal. Not all boards are created equal. And so some are bigger, some are smaller. I think that would be the practical side of it. And so some of the schach is being held up by higher boards, higher walls, and some is held up by lower walls. That would be my guess. In any event, okay, so we've got the
lower schach has to be more than one tevach or less than one tevach, the space open.
The empty space, we said it's really a debate among the commentaries, Rishonim, how much space there needs to be. Of course, if you want to fulfill all opinions, it should be the same exact space as the upper schach is. And then you fulfill every opinion that there is. That it fits. According to the Ramah, the way Mishnah Berurah understood it, sounded like as long as it's big enough to fit the upper, the upper schach. So it doesn't have to be so exact, maybe, but as long as it's big enough to handle. And then other opinions that as long as it's a tefach, even if it's not big enough to handle it. And then the other opinion is it doesn't matter how much space it is. Okay. So we've basically gone over the Gemara. Let me start. I'm gonna start on page 22b, Chaf Beis Amud Beis. V'chein shtei koires hamatimos. So we're dealing with the case where I want to go over the question, and then we'll get the answer. We need to know the question very clearly to see the answer. The question that we're dealing with is the laws of Eruv to make a koira, this beam, and we're seeing from here, we're gonna try to prove, Rav Ashi is trying to prove that you don't need a tefach, a handbreadth size of something on the upper level to be a handbreadth in order to say Chavoit Rami. Even if it's less than a handbreadth, you could still say Chavoit Rami. Where do we see this? So he says, he brings this source, the laws of the, it's a brisa regarding the laws of Rishus HaRabim, Rishus HaYachid, carrying in private domain, public domain, an alley. And this is what it's talking about. It's a brisa. And the brisa continues and it says, V'chein, we're third line on the top of page 22b. V'chein shtei koires hamatimos. And also similarly, if you have two of these beams that are matimos, they're like twins, they're next to each other. Loi bezu kedei lekabel ariach. Each one is a little too thin, a bit too thin to be considered a kaira, a beam to make a fourth wall for an alley. An alley has 3 walls, and you, according to rabbinic law, you need to make a fourth wall or imaginary fourth wall. That fourth wall should be a size of a tefach thick. Why should it be a size of a tefach thick, or width, I should say? It should be a tefach, a handbreadth. In order to be able, it has to be thick enough to be able to handle a half a brick on top of it. And even though a half a brick is really 1.5 handbreadths, and this is, we're saying it all has to be is 1 handbreadth. So Rashi, and of course the Gemara there, deals with that problem. And basically, even though it has a little lip that goes over each side, it's okay. It's not a problem. You use they fill it in with some mud or cement and something, and therefore it's considered that it's able to hold a half a brick. 1 handbreadth is good enough. That's the rule, as long as it's 1 handbreadth thick. Now here you have 2 small ones.
Rabbi,
gave yesterday was 2 2x4s. Yes, W.
I have a picture. Want to see?
I want to see in maybe 1 or 2 minutes after we finish both cases.
Okay.
So just give me 1 or 2 minutes and I'll tell you when. When you have these 2 beams that are not enough to handle an ariach, a half a brick, so they're not a tefach, they're not 3 plus inches each. Instead, each one is missing maybe 1.5 or 1 3/4. Neither of the 2 are sufficient to be a tefach, a handbreadth. But together, in mekables ariach l'roch by tefach, if together they could handle this brick, in other words, the brick, the width of the brick, because the length of the brick is 3 tefachs, the width of the brick is 1.5 tefachs. So if it could handle the width of the brick 1.5 tefachs, meaning that together it's 1 tefach thick, tefach ein tzarich lavi karacheres, then you don't have to switch these 2 for a different beam. Instead, you would just leave them. They're kosher. They're good. But if they're not sufficient to handle an ariach, which means that they have a thickness of a tefach, so like if not, then tzarich lavi karacheres, you would need to bring another beam. Rav Shimon Gamliel says that you could be more lenient than that. That's a very strict view, Rav Shimon Gamliel says, and I am more lenient. And he says, you could separate the 2. You don't have to put the 2 beams together. you have two 2x4s, let's say, and there's a space. If you make a space in between, and up to three handbreadths. So what happens is you could place, if it could handle the half a brick, if it could hold the half a brick. This is just a measurement. What we're doing is measuring the strength of the beam to be considered an imaginary wall. It needs to have a certain strength to it, a certain width and a certain strength. Now, Rosh Gamliel says the width is not such a problem because we could spread it apart and make it, it would be considered that it's maybe enough of a width because you could spread it apart, even though there's empty space in the middle. But the problem is it's strong enough. So he says you could even spread it apart up to 3 handbreadths, and it could handle the length of the half a brick. The width of the half a brick is 1.5 handbreadths. The length of it is 3 handbreadths. Even if you spread it apart and it could handle the length of it, that's also kosher. Even if it could handle the length of it, which is shleisha tvachim, which means that you'd spread it apart and it could handle the 3 handbreadths of the brick. You don't have to bring another beam because it has the strength to handle that. And if not, you'd have to bring another beam. Now, at this point, we really don't yet have anything to do with chavoit rami until the next line. The next line is where we're going to start dealing with chavoit rami. This was just brought as part of the brisa, which we brought the entire brisa. However, at this point, we're going to see David's picture. Thank you, David, for sharing it.
Rabbi, also while he's putting the picture, the word matimot, they're translating here as parallel. 2 parallel.
Oh, you know what? That's a good translation.
Yeah.
Rashi adds ke'ein tu'umim as twins, but parallel. Yeah. Okay.
Well, Baruch Hashem, we have a set of twins. My youngest boys are twins.
Very nice. So the word matimais, I guess, is connected to that word of twins. Okay. That's the whole picture. That's it, David? So basically, here you have this alleyway. And this alleyway is an alleyway that's used by, we see the different courtyards here. Each person has their own house and they have a courtyard. That might be a shul, and this one has a house and that has a house or whatever. And each one walks through this alleyway to get to the Reshus Harabim, the public domain, which is outside of these 2 beams, outside of these walls that are blocking the alleyway, that are on top of the entrance. Now, this scenario is these 2 beams are not a tefach thick, because if it would be a handbreadth, that would be good enough, one of them. But it must be that it's smaller than a handbreadth. And so together, together they're not handbreadths. And so what did the guy do? He's separating the 2, and they're within 3 handbreadths, so it's strong enough. They look strong enough to handle the weight of a brick, or what we would call a half a brick, an ariach. It's 1.5 handbreadths by 3, could handle that type of a brick. And therefore, that would be, according to Rosh Gamliel, this would be sufficient to make this a 4-walled domain. 4-walled domain, it could be a proper mavoi that's closed off, and you could do your shitufei mavuos. You could then collect the food and consider it that it's a private area they could carry from their courtyards into that alley. So that's the story of a leniency, one opinion's leniency. We have 2 parallel beams that are not next to each other. The other case was where they were actually next to each other, and that was the other opinion. And that was as long as together they reach a size of a handbreadth, that would be kosher. But Reb Shimon Gamliel says you don't need that. Even if they don't have that, it's also fine. You spread them apart, and then as long as it could handle the the brick, it's also considered an imaginary wall. Okay, thank you, David. We're going to stop the stop share, and we'll go back to the question of the Gemara. And this is the main. This is getting back to the main point. And the main point is the next line. And this is we're about 10 lines from the top of the page, 22b. If you have one of these beams that's higher, one is lower. Rabbi Yosi bar Yehuda, Omer Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yehuda says, Royin ha'elyoina kilu hilamata. So imagine you have these two beams next to each other, but they're on different levels. One is higher, one is lower. So we imagine that the upper one is lowered, or the lower one is higher. So we can say this special law that we can put the two beams next to each other, and will vaj and as long as the upper one is not too high, we've learned, if you remember from day one of Tractate Sukkah, we learned that a mavoi can't be higher than 20 amos. That was the beginning Mishnah, the first Mishnah. Why does it say by mavoi this yamayit, and by sukkah it just says it's psula. It's a sukkah that's above, right? So the law by mavoi was that it can't be above 20 amos. So if it's above 20 amos, so the upper one, of course, can't be above 20 amos, and the lower one, the lower one can't be below 10 handbreadths, because below 10 handbreadths would not be a imaginary wall. It's too low. And then so if this and that would be between within the 20 amas, cubits, it would be within the 20 cubits, then Amrina Chavait Rami Aval Gav the less Beitava. Then the law is that even though each one separately doesn't have a handbreadth thickness, nevertheless, we're going to lower one to the other one, or higher one to the upper one. We're going to be able to put them together and say, this is a koira, this is a beam, and it's koshering your eru. So the bottom line is that we say Chavait Rami, and we must be saying it even though the upper one doesn't have a handbreadth. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the upper one does have a handbreadth, and maybe it's not a kasha. The upper one has a handbreadth. Maybe, how do you know that we're talking about that the upper one doesn't have a handbreadth? We were saying all along the upper one needs to have a handbreadth. And now the Gemara is saying, Rav Ashi is proving from this brisa, no, you see, that doesn't need to have a handbreadth, the upper one, even if it's less than a hand. How do you know? Maybe the upper one is talking about a case where the upper one has a handbreadth. And with that, that's why we say Chavait Rabbi. Maybe it's not a strong question. Maybe the upper one is talking about that it has a handbreadth. And then, okay, it's a handbreadth. Now we could say Chavait Rami. And that maybe that's the case. How do we know for sure that we're talking about that it's less than a handbreadth? Anyone? And yes, David?
This says this is difficult according to Rava's opinion, as he holds that Chavot Rami doesn't apply when the width of the upper crossbeam is less than a handbreadth.
Yeah, I understand. That's the question. I'm asking, how do you know that we're talking about a case, that this case is a proof against Rava? Who says? Maybe it's talking about the upper one is a handbreadth, the upper beam. You have two beams. The upper one is a handbreadth. We could say Chavot Rami, lower it. Now we can lower it, and now it's considered kosher. We have who says the upper one? Maybe the upper one has the size of a handbreadth. How's Rava proving from here? Who says talking about it's small and you need to combine it with the bottom one. Maybe it's a handbreadth already, and that's why we say Chavot Rami. Anyone?
Says thin.
Say that again, Ezra.
It says thin.
Because it says thin. Let It says one is above, one is below. So in a certain sense, you're right. It does say before that it sounds like it's a continuation. But I would answer this question. So you're right, Ezra. But I would answer the question logically. If imagine the top one has a tefach, do you need to lower it to the bottom one? It's already you have your kaira. Of course, it doesn't have a tefach. If it had a tefach, what are you lowering it for? Chavayt rami. What do you need chavayt rami for? You've got yourself exactly what you need. You've got a beam across. It's kosher. It must be that it doesn't have a tefach. That's why you're trying to upper the bottom one or lower the other one, because you don't have a tefach. If you had a tefach, then there would be no question about this. So that's how it's approved. The whole problem is we don't have a tefach. We're trying to find a way to make it a tefach. If it was a tefach, then there really is no issue. So the Gemara's answer is Amar Le. Okay, back to the Gemara. Amar Le. So he tells him, and who is telling who over here? So Rav Ashi was asking the question to Rav Kahana. So Rav Kahana is answering him back, and he's saying Amar Le. So he tells him back, Teritz ve'emahachi. You have to answer and say this, that the Brisa is not talking about Chavayt Rami. We're not using Chavayt Rami. You can't. Chavayt Rami is a special law that you need a tefach to say Chavayt Rami. You know what? We're dealing with a whole different law. It's called Lavud. And you have to add a little point here. That when the Brisa says, as long as the upper beam is not too high, it's not above 20 cubits, rather it's within 20 cubits, and the lower one is right next to it within 3 handbreadths. So I shouldn't say it's right next to it, but it's within 3 handbreadths, and therefore you could say lavud. So in other words, the upper one can't be too high, and as long as the upper one's not too high and the other one is not too far away, it's within 3 handbreadths. Guess what? We say lavud. Inami, or also another option is the opposite case. Bilvad shaloi tehei tachtoina lemata me'asara. As long, the other option is that as long as the lower one is not lemata me'asara, it's within 10 handbreadths from the ground, ela rather lemaila me'asara, rather it's above 10 handbreadths from the ground. Of course, that's the rule that it has to be at least above 10 handbreadths. The elyoina smuchala b'pachas mishleisha, and the upper one is near it. You have to add those words that the upper one obviously is right near it, within 3 handbreadths. So it's the din of lavur. So we're not using the law of Chavayt Rami. Why not? Because you can't. Chavayt Rami applies if you have a tefach. Here we don't have that, so we're relying on the law of lavud. Aval shloisha, but if there's a separation of 3 handbreadths, then kivan delespe tefach, since it doesn't have a handbreadth, lo yamrinan chavayt rami, you would never be able to say this law of chavayt rami because you don't have a handbreadth, and obviously you don't have a handbreadth because if you had a handbreadth, you wouldn't need this whole type of attachments. You don't need to attach anything else. So since it doesn't have a handbreadth, we'll never say in these type of cases chavayt rami. Where do you say chavayt rami? You would say it in a case of like Sukkah, where you have a handbreadth on the top on one schach, and then maybe you could say chavayt rami. But the laws of oihel, you could say chavayt rami. But in the case of Eruvin, you don't have chavayt rami. Okay, so that's basically the answer that the Gemara gives. And bottom line is that, as we just saw in Shulchan Aruch, that the Sukkah Hamaduv Leles, if it has a tefach, Shulchan Aruch says we follow Rava, that you could actually have the law of Chavoit Rami. You could have this law of Chavoit Rami and include, which would be an interesting sukkah. Imagine if you have a sukkah that's made like a crown. You have like up and down walls, and then you put the schach on each of the upper walls and on the lower walls, and you could maybe do a Chavoit Rami sukkah. Be an interesting sukkah, like yeah, interesting. You have schach. Some schach is 10 feet higher than the other schach. It'd be like you could have a Chavoit Rami sukkah, and you could have full of sunlight. I don't know, it wouldn't be so great here in Florida. It would be a lot of sunlight, but it would be halachically a kosher sukkah.
Rabbi,
Yes, Moshe.
that would be like having bamboo one on top of the other, each successive pole to the other one on top as well, right? One which would be like, it wouldn't be corresponding to each other, but it would be like a zigzag up and down, and then the sun at top would create more shade than sunlight. But if it was on an angle, it would let more sun inside, right?
Right, and still it would be kosher, and still it's going to be kosher, even though it's going to be more sunlight than shade.
Because of Chavoit Rami.
Because of Chavoit Rami, it's a kosher sukkah.
Yeah.
Okay. The next Gemara. Let's do the next piece. So the Gemara says, when the shade is more than the sunlight, it's kosher. And you have to remember, number one, the Mishnah that we just learned, and then the Mishnah in the beginning of the parak. The Mishnah we just learned mentioned that if it has more shade than sunlight, it's kosher. That's our Mishnah's statement. And that means that if it's equal, maybe it's not kosher. Only if it's more shade than sunlight, it's kosher. What happens if it's half and half? Sounds like it's not kosher. Now, in the beginning of the Masechta, we had where it said, if it's chamsa meruba mitzilasa, it's not kosher. If it's more sunlight than shade, it's not kosher. It sounds like that if it's half and half, it's equal, it is kosher. So our Mishnah implies, the Mishnah that we just learned on page 22 implies that if it's equal, it's not kosher. The Mishnah in the beginning of the tractate implies if it's equal, it is kosher. So the Gemara now has this problem, has this question. Our Mishnah said it's kshera ha ki hadadi, but if they would be like each other, sula, the sukkah would be invalid. The Gemara asks, "V'atanan, didn't we learn? Be'idach pirkin, wasn't it taught? Didn't we learn in the Mishnah in the other chapter, in the first chapter, the first word, the first Mishnah of the tractate? If it's more sun than shade, it's invalid. Haki hadadi, that would imply that if they are equal, if they are like each other, kashera, it'll be kosher. So here it implies if it's equal, it's invalid. Beginning of the tractate, if they're equal, it's kosher, it's valid, like kasha. So the Gemara answers, it's not a question. Like kasha, kan milmaila, kan milmato. And these are the words that the commentaries have fun with. Here we're talking about above, and here we're talking about below. What does that mean? So Rashi says that when we say that if they're equal, it's invalid, that is when you have equal schach on your sukkah. You have half schach and half empty space. We're not talking about that you have 3 handbreadths of empty space in one spot, because that would invalidate your sukkah. But you have it distributed nicely, empty space and schach, and ultimately it's half and half. And in that case, that's above. When you have above, meaning by the schach, it's half and half. What happens is, how much sunlight and how much shade are you going to have? The sunlight is going to expand as the sun shines through your sukkah. So since the sun, as it gets closer to the ground, it's going to be much more sunlight than shade. And that's why if it's equal, it's going to be, if it's equal schach to empty space, it's going to be an invalid sukkah. Why? Because you really have more sunlight than shade. What do you mean I have equal? No, on the schach level, it's equal. But on the sukkah, in the sukkah, it is majority sunlight. So in the sukkah, it's majority sunlight, that would be invalid. In this, where it's half and half, it's kosher. When would that be? That's when it's below. If it's half and half, it's kosher. That's when it's equal sunlight and shade below. It's kosher because then that means that you have more schach than empty space. The more schach than empty space, then even though in the sukkah it's half and half, it's kosher, and it would be that would be a way to. This answers the contradiction. Yes, David.
Before you sign off, today's my birthday.
Ah.
So I wanted to use this opportunity to wish everybody brachas in physical and spiritual and gashmius and ruchnius, children, health, and parnasa. Everyone here should be blessed, you and your families, and the entire world should have a bracha from all this. We should all be a nachas to our parents and our ancestors, and those who are connected to the Rebbe, and everything should be good. As much brachas I can give, I'm giving.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Hashem should give you a shnas hatzlacha begashmias and beruchnias. It should be
Amen.
fully gesund.
Amen.
A lot
Thank
of
you.
Yiddish, Chassidish, Nachas, Parnasa,
Amen.
everything. Mali Hashem Hashas Lubchol Teva.
Amen. Kol mavarach mizbarach.
Amen. Shkayach. Okay. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Sei
Ja,
gesund.
schön,
Bye-bye.
Sei gesund.